Welcome to Pop Your Biz. I'm Amanda Butler Schley, your go-to business lawyer and purveyor of all things pop culture. Join me as I break down today's hottest legal headlines into bite-sized pieces. We use the lawsuits of your favorite celebrities and worldwide brands to teach you how to keep your business on the right side of the law. Let's dive in. Hey, all you CEOs, entrepreneurs, and law nerds. I'm Amanda Butler Schley, managing partner here at the Business Law Group. Our YouTube channel is here to serve up and to evaluate celebrity lawsuits and use those juicy claims as a teaching tool for all of you. Whether you run a large company, work for one, or are just generally here for the shade, we want to break down each of these lawsuits claim by claim and provide you with our legal commentary on whether the lawsuit has any actual merit outside of the media hype that we have all heard. First up in our series is a singer that's near and dear to my heart, Lizzo. I want to talk today about all things Lizzo and her lawsuits, particularly the lawsuit that was brought against her by three of her former backup dancers who sued her in Los Angeles in July of 2023. Some of the allegations that the former dancers make are salacious, and they're certainly designed to be that way. Part of the plaintiff's strategy in any labor and employment lawsuit is really to paint a picture, a very negative picture about the employment experience, and that's certainly the strategies that the dancers have employed here. But I want to get into my analysis of this lawsuit kind of outside of what's been reported in the media, and really look at what's involved in these claims, what's involved in sustaining them, meaning how are they going to be able to stay in court, and then also talk about generally plaintiff strategy around labor and employment lawsuits. If you are a business owner and you are a growing business, one of the first lawsuits that you're likely to experience is going to be a labor and employment lawsuit. And that's simply because as we grow and we have more and more employees, the likelihood that one of them files an EEOC charge and then takes that to court after they've gotten the clearance from the EEOC is rather large. And so oftentimes I'll get a call from a client who is just simply in a panic. They've been sued, they've been served with a lawsuit, and in reading the lawsuit, they are really taken aback by the picture that is painted of their company, potentially of themselves or their top managers. And so when we look at the lawsuit today, I want you to kind of get my analysis and my perspective from that lawyer that's really looking at it, that understands how these lawsuits really work. Okay, I've pulled up the complaint, which I've linked in the notes so that you can follow along, or you can follow along on the screen with me. You'll see that we have three plaintiffs: Crystal Williams, Ariana Davis, and Noel Rodriguez. Those are the three former backup dancers. They are suing Big Girl Big Touring Inc., a Delaware corporation, Melissa Jefferson, who is also known as Lizzo, and then also suing Shirlene Quigley, which is apparently Lizzo's dance team captain. The complaint does a good job of summarizing the total of 9 legal claims that the plaintiffs are suing under. The first 6 of these are labor and employment law claims. And you'll notice that these are all referred to as FEHA, which is a California statute that's very similar to Title VII under federal law. And those statutes simply prohibit an employer from discriminating against an employee based upon any sort of protected class. So they're prohibited from discrimination against people based on gender, based on race, based on religion, and also based upon disability. Those are all of the protected classes that we have here. You can see the first complaint is a hostile work environment or sexual harassment claim. The second is a failure to prevent that. The third is a religious harassment claim, which I've never heard of religious harassment. Typically, it's called religious discrimination, but we're going to look at that later on. A failure to prevent or remedy the religious harassment, racial harassment, disability discrimination, and intentional interference with prospective economic advantage. Ooh, that's a tough one to say, but that's probably going to be a contract type claim. And then finally, we have an assault claim and a false imprisonment claim. The assault claim is against Lizzo from Rodriguez and Davis, and then the false imprisonment claim is Davis against the production company. You'll notice that the plaintiffs have, like I said, they've sued in state court, probably from a strategic perspective, but they've also requested a jury trial, which is certainly an interesting strategic decision considering that Lizzo is so popular. But you know, that can either help or hurt them. It just really depends. Here they have assumed that it's going to help them that Lizzo has such she's such a public figure. We've talked a little bit about jurisdiction and venue. Again, I think it was a strategic decision for them to sue in state court, and they've actually only allowed state court claims, and that's obviously to prevent moving the venue or changing the venue to federal court. Here we're going to get all of the color and the context for this lawsuit, and the plaintiffs are going to explain all the events that give rise to their legal causes of action, and they're going to tell their story in a way that's most beneficial to them. Often the allegations read like a telenovela, and this one is no exception, because these stories are best told in chronological order. This case, as we talked about, it involves 3 professional dancers. 2 of them were chosen on a reality TV show called Watch Out for the Big Girls, which is a show that Lizzo had on Amazon Prime. And in this reality show, the dancers are kind of trying out or auditioning to be on the dance team. As part of trying out for that or being on the reality show, Miss Davis discloses that she has that she struggles with depression, anxiety, and binge eating disorder. And she also ends up telling Miss Quigley that she is a virgin. Okay, so during filming for the show, that's really when Miss Davis and Miss Williams first meet Miss Quigley. And she's one of the judges. She's the dance team captain, and she's super vocal about her Christian beliefs. And she takes every opportunity to preach to the dancers at all times. She takes a particular interest, apparently, in Miss Davis, who was a virgin at the time, and it became a topic of extreme importance to Miss Quigley. She brings it up all the time, and in fact, she is interviewed on a show, and she posts the fact that Miss Davis is a virgin to social media without Miss Davis's consent. So pretty inappropriate stuff. All right, on the Watch Out for the Big Girls show, and I don't know if y'all had the chance to see that, but I went back and watched it specifically to get kind of an idea of what happened on the show. But one of the episodes has Lizzo sending the dancers or the prospective dancers to a nude photo shoot with the idea that it's going to get them kind of in touch with their body and give them some body positivity. But this did not really go well for Miss Davis. It caused her to have some extreme anxiety, and she felt like she was basically forced to have to choose between participating in this nude photo shoot and or getting the job. And ultimately, they consented and allowed her to participate in just a nude bra and underwear, and she did not have to go fully nude. But the plaintiffs are saying that this foreshadowed the sexually charged environment and the uncomfortable environment that the employees are forced to endure over their tenure with Lizzo and the production company. So once Watch Out for the Big Girls wraps in September of 2021, Miss Davis and Miss Williams are both selected, and they start on the dance team and start performing with Lizzo at festival appearances in September of 2021 through April of 2022. While they are rehearsing and in preparation for the special tour that Lizzo is starting, they're working very closely with Miss Quigley, who's continuing to proselytize and preach to everybody about her Christianity. But in a very strange kind of Dr. Jekyll and Mrs. Hyde situation, apparently Miss Quigley is also very sexually open and maybe an oversharer in that department. Line 15, Miss Quigley also had a party trick in which she would simulate oral sex on a banana in front of the rest of the dance cast. These instances always were unprompted and made plaintiffs uncomfortable. The sexually inappropriate behavior didn't stop at, quote, faux fellatio. Really good term of art there, fellatio. Despite her staunch beliefs in opposition to premarital sex, Miss Quigley had no problem sharing her masturbatory habits with the dance cast, often stating things to the effect that masturbating was against her religion, but today she had oopsie. Miss Quigley's sexually explicit comments were so pervasive that the entire dance team knew about her sexual fantasy of having 10 penises in her face. Again, super inappropriate to be telling the people that you work with anything of that sort. So even though Miss Quigley is saying all these really sexually overt things and inappropriate things, she's also still proselytizing and preaching to all of the dance team. And apparently she becomes really invested in Miss Davis's virginity. And she makes it clear to the entire dance team that only proper Christians can really be proper Christians by abstaining from sex, from premarital sex. Miss Quigley also singled out Miss Rodriguez as a non-believer and made it her mission to preach to Miss Rodriguez. Miss Quigley even told other dance cast members that it was her mission to minister to Miss Rodriguez during the tour. When cast members told Miss Rodriguez of Miss Quigley's intent, Miss Rodriguez actually asked Miss Quigley to stop from, pushing her religious beliefs upon her, at which point apparently Miss Quigley becomes irate and yells at Miss Rodriguez, at one point saying, "No job and no one will stop me from talking about the Lord." So certainly we have a situation that's being described of a very uncomfortable work environment due to this kind of dual personality of Miss Quigley. She also does the same thing with Miss Davis, trying to get Miss Davis to adopt, her dogma or her particular view of Christianity. Finally, we get to paragraph 25, in which, it's stated that Miss Quigley's religious beliefs were really not just only Miss Quigley's. It appears that others echoed her that were in management positions or supervisory roles at BGT. And they say that before rehearsals and performances, the dance team would pray together. And even though it wasn't an official requirement, it became clear that the engagement was compulsory. The responsibility to lead the group in prayer rotated across the dancers. And when it was Miss Rodriguez's turn, who we know is a believer, she politely declines. But despite declining every time she's asked and continued to be pressured by Miss Quigley to participate, and ultimately feels judged for declining to lead the dance cast in prayer. So Miss Rodriguez was struck by Miss Quigley's insistence on overstepping. Accordingly, Miss Rodriguez actually takes her concerns to the assistant choreographer, Melissa Charlotte. And Miss Charlotte shows some empathy for Miss Rodriguez's concerns, but just suggests that she should take the complaints up with Miss Quigley herself, which, as we know, had been fairly useless of a strategy up until that point. On another occasion, while touring with Lizzo, Miss Williams accidentally brushes up against one of the tour bus drivers, and the driver responds by saying, "You can back up on me again," implying that Miss Williams' accidental touch gave him sexual gratification. A different driver was known for playing sexually explicit lyric songs on the tour bus. These interactions made the dance cast incredibly uncomfortable and even fear for their safety. Miss Davis and Miss Rodriguez reported the driver's inappropriate behavior to BGBT on multiple occasions, but they do nothing to protect the dancers. Management merely questioned whether the drivers were drunk or driving safely and did nothing to make the dancers feel any safer than they did prior to reporting the driver's behavior. This is somewhat problematic, we're going to talk about later. So as the domestic leg of the special tour comes to a close, then we really start seeing some problems in European shows. And those are going to really relate around Lizzo herself. Part of the problems start, though, even with management, because the dancers have been told that they're on a, quote, soft hold at this time, which means they are not allowed to take other work, or they're encouraged not to take other work, but they're also not being paid by Lizzo or the touring company. And so the plaintiffs really become financially dependent, and all of their income kind of centers around the special tour. But all of a sudden, they learn that the musicians that are on the tour are going to be paid what's called a retainer, in which they're paid a portion of their tour rate while they're on break in exchange for not taking other jobs. And so the plaintiffs, the dancers, along with, these three dancers, along with all the other dancers, start to negotiate for the same type of treatment. And these discussions continued all the way through the start of the European leg of the tour. So, they talk a little bit about how waiting for that tour to start really becomes financially hard on all of the performers, and the retainer becomes very important to all of them. In February of 2023, the plaintiffs and the whole dance cast arrived to London to start rehearsals and perform with Lizzo at the Brit Awards show. The plaintiffs perform with Lizzo as well at a show in Amsterdam. And after the show, Lizzo invites all of the dancers out to a bar that's called the Banana Bar. And this is where things get really crazy. They say that attending, this after work event is not compulsory. It's not compulsory. It's not mandatory, but it feels like it is, because Lizzo is known to have eyes and ears everywhere and likes good people with good energy. And she typically favors those dancers that go out with her and socialize with her outside of the actual shows. So, on this particular evening, Lizzo sent an invite through her close friend and member of the dance cast named Shanta. And Miss Davis and Rodriguez were at dinner celebrating the birthday of one of the supporting vocal performers when they got the invitation. And Shanta hurried the dancers, including the plaintiffs, to accept or decline. And feeling that their absence would be noticed and or taken personally by Lizzo, plaintiffs accepted the invitation. As it turns out, Lizzo had planned a night out in Amsterdam's notorious red light district, which is obviously known for an abundance of sex theaters, sex shops, clubs, and bars where nudity is on full display. The main event of the night was at a club called the Banana Bar. That's actually, it means banana bar. And here the plaintiffs are allowed to interact with completely nude performers. So it's a pretty risque club. It's a full strip club. When plaintiffs expressed misgivings about the plans for the night, Shonda stated it was too late to back out because she'd already told Lizzo the head count for the evening, and feeling that pressure, they reluctantly agree to go along. When they get there, things really deteriorate. While at the Banana Bar, things get out of hand. Lizzo began inviting cast members to take turns touching the nude performers, catching dildos launched from the performers' vaginas, and eating bananas protruding from the performers' vaginas. Lizzo then turned her attention to Miss Davis and began pressuring Miss Davis to touch the breast of one of the nude women performing at the club. Lizzo began leading a chant, goading Miss Davis. Miss Davis said 3 or 4 times, or said 3 times, loud enough for all to hear, "I'm good," expressing her desire not to participate, but the chant grows louder and louder. And Miss Davis ultimately does engage with the performer. And she says, "I'd rather not because I'm cool here in the corner." But finally, she kind of relents and ends up participating. And after she finally touches the performer's breast, the group bursts out in laughter. Miss David abashedly laughs along, trying to hide how uncomfortable this interaction made her feel. And her efforts to conceal her discomfort were apparently unsuccessful, as on separate occasions, management, as well as Lizzo's security team, asked Miss Davis if she was okay. Miss Davis replied, "Kind of," to one request and no to the other. So she actually told management that she was uncomfortable in response to the situation. So management was fully aware how she felt in that situation. In addition to pressuring an unwilling Miss Davis into interacting with a nude performer, plaintiffs and all in attendance were unable to avoid witnessing Lizzo's incredibly public displays of sexual affection with her own boyfriend, where at one point the couple exuberantly took Shanta and 2 members of the band which performed with Lizzo on tour to a back room before returning sometime later. Obviously, that's implying that, they went out to participate in some sort of sexual activity. Again, very salacious facts. Upon her return to the main club, Lizzo began to pressure a member of her security team to participate in the night's debauchery. Lizzo badgered the security guard to get him onto stage, and she yells, "Take it off," basically showing that she has no bodily autonomy for employees. Now, this is interesting that they include this paragraph because the security driver or the security guard is not one of the plaintiffs here. So, he's not making an allegation. They're really doing this solely and strictly to paint this picture of how this night goes down. The next incident that they get into is a night that's spent at the Crazy Horse, where they allege that Lizzo never even tells them that the Crazy Horse is a nude cabaret. That seems to me to be a little far-fetched. Lizzo might not have told them, but the Crazy Horse is like a very well-known nude cabaret. So regardless of whether or not you were told or not, the likelihood that you would know that it was a nude cabaret would be pretty high. Also, you could Google whether or not, what the club was, and it would be very obvious that it's a nude cabaret. But the Crazy Horse is known for being very tasteful cabaret, very different than what they described in Amsterdam. But at the same time, it does involve nudity, and it is an extracurricular activity that the dance team feels, or that these plaintiffs particularly feel, that they're made to participate in, even though they don't want to. So in March of 2023, the dancers submit a request to management and to Lizzo to get the similar retainer that the musicians are getting. And that retainer is going to pay them 50% of their weekly tour rate to ensure that while they're on break, they're getting paid. And after they make that request, the accountant, one of the BGBT accountants, responds with a counter offer where she offers to pay them 25% of the requested 50% retainer. And then in that same email, she essentially starts to scold the dancers for, quote, unacceptable and disrespectful behavior, stating that it's cause for termination. But nowhere in the email does she explain why the behavior or what behavior is unacceptable and disrespectful. Only the dance cast, which is comprised of full-figured women of color, were ever spoken to in this manner, giving the plaintiffs the impression that these comments were really racial and fat-phobic comments, which seems very strange, right? For a woman like Lizzo's management team to be treating the dance cast, who are comprised of, as they say, women of color, differently from the musicians that had the same request and actually were receiving the 50% retainer amount. The plaintiffs and their fellow dancers were blindsided by the allegations of the email, and they request a meeting with somebody named Kevin Bielsler. Mr. Bielsler agreed to meet, but when he arrived for the meeting, he simply stated that he had no time to talk to the dancers. Conveniently, he did have time to talk to the vocal performers and to the musicians. So the dancers kind of see it as him blowing them off. When they finally get back to the United States, the dancers were once again placed on a soft hold and they were unable to take more jobs. And so in April, the dancers and the management were able to finally get to an agreement where management was going to pay them the 50% retainer. Unfortunately, despite the advances the dancers made in obtaining the retainer, it became clear that BGE's management began to lash out at the dancers. So what they're setting up here is kind of a retaliation claim. Like, in exchange, after they pointed out that they were being treated differently from what I'm going to assume is either an all-male group of musicians or an all-white group of musicians, this group of women of color, when they even though they received the 50% retainer, by pointing it out, it starts this retaliatory behavior by management. So starting in paragraph 44, they don't ever tell us that about the musicians, right? So we don't know whether the musicians are mostly white or mostly men. They do say that the management team is almost entirely white Europeans who often accuse the Black members of the dance team of being lazy, unprofessional, and having bad attitudes. Not only do these words ring familiar as tropes used to disparage and discourage Black women from advocating for themselves, but the same accusations were not levied against dancers who were not Black. So I'm assuming that most of the dancers were women of color, but apparently they're not all African American. So maybe they're treating the lighter skinned brown women differently than the African American women or the darker skinned women. We're going to have to get into that a lot more. In April, the dance cast was scheduled for an 8-hour rehearsal. And in this rehearsal, they are accused of drinking alcohol or being unprofessional prior to the rehearsal. And Lizzo states that all the dancers would be required to re-audition for their spots. And if she was dissatisfied with their performance, then the dancers were going to be fired and sent home. So we've never had this kind of circumstance, but apparently all of a sudden Lizzo feels like all of her dancers are not good. And coincidentally, that is very closely related in time to the dancers finally getting this 50% retainer they had been asking for. They talk about the re-audition, and it sounds brutal. Basically, they are forced to re-audition for an 8-hour day that actually goes to a 12-hour day. And during that period, Miss Davis is so fearful about leaving the stage, that instead of leaving the stage to relieve herself, she actually soils herself on stage. She's really embarrassed, obviously, and when she has the chance to, she goes back in to try to find some clean clothes to change into, and she's given, lo and behold, a transparent pair of shorts and no undergarments. And after that, she's continuing to dance for the rest of that time in this revealing getup, which we can imagine was probably not great for Miss Davis's state of mind, right? Her anxiety would have been through the roof. Shortly after that, the retrial or the re-audition, then Lizzo calls another meeting. She says, look, I'm reiterating, none of your jobs are safe. I've heard that you have been drinking alcohol before the show, or drinking alcohol before the show is prohibited. To which Miss Williams basically responds, nobody's drinking alcohol before these shows. Like, that's not happening. And Lizzo mockingly responds with, well, if you're not, good, then good for y'all. But essentially, maybe implying that, there was some reason for the dancers' previous poor performance, or that the dancers had been performing poorly, and then that had to be related to the alcohol. But at this point, Lizzo and Miss Williams don't have the best of relationships, because I guess, Miss Williams had stood up to Lizzo at this point, and she did not appreciate it. Shortly after the re-auditions, then Miss Davis, the anxiety-ridden virgin, gets called into a private meeting with Lizzo and with the choreographer, Mrs. Scott, at which point they kind of pressure her into saying, like, we don't know why your performance is so bad, but implying that possibly it's, she's seeming less bubbly and less vivacious than she was prior to the store starting. And in her mind, or in professional dance speak, they say that often that's kind of code for you've gained too much weight, or that there has been weight gain. That's all seeming, though, to come from really the perspective of Miss Davis. I don't see any words in this paragraph in which anybody, did anything other than just seem to check on, is something off with you? Are you okay? Your performance you seem to be struggling more than you were when we started the tour. And then she takes that to mean like, well, it must be about my weight. But there is nothing said in this paragraph that leads me to say that that's really what happened. Miss Davis stated that she was dealing with some personal issues and that she would never let it affect her work, and that, in fact, she really thought that her performance as a dancer had improved, that she was a better dancer today than she was when she was hired. But Lizzo and Miss Scott seemed to be pretty unsatisfied with that answer and pressed her, just as they had pressed her at the Bannon bar, to kind of to say that, she really wasn't performing that well. And Miss Davis left with the impression that she needed to explain her weight gain and disclose some intimate details about her life in order to keep her job. So this is where Miss Davis says that she was kind of offered a chance to go to therapy or to have some time off to attend therapy, but the offer really caught Miss Davis as strange. And she felt like if she were to accept the offer, that she would be kind of seen as a weaker member of the dance team or the dance cast. So she ends up declining the offer. I don't see how that's horrible that Lizzo and the company offered her some time off, but certainly she could have taken it personally. So now we're back to Miss Williams, right? Miss Williams is the dancer that's pretty vocal, and she doesn't really have a lot of fear in standing up for herself. And lo and behold, Miss Williams is terminated. She's terminated in the lobby of the hotel that the dancers were staying at by Miss Gugliotta, which is apparently somebody that's in management. And she's told that the reason that she's fired is due to, quote, budget cuts. That's very interesting. I want y'all to remember that, because that is a stated reason for termination. She's actually told that the reason that she was fired is because of budget cuts. And so one of the ways that you can prove whether or not an employer is telling the truth about discrimination or not is to prove that the reason that they state for termination, here being that they had to do some budget cuts, is false. And that because that reason is false, it leads us to conclude that it's potentially related to some other action which is unlawful, such as retaliation for reporting discrimination. So this is a very, very big paragraph for the plaintiffs. You might pass over it, but it becomes very important. Ms. Williams is the only dancer to get fired on this day, although the other two dancers are going to be fired in short order. So Ms. Gugliotta responds telling Ms. Williams that Lizzo isn't the best with these things and that she has a lot going on. And that's the reason why Lizzo hadn't fired Ms. Williams herself. And then she goes on to say that Ms. Williams does not have the best attitude and comes across as snarky. At this point, Ms. Rodriguez steps in and she says, look, I don't think that you should have publicly terminated Ms. Williams. And Ms. Gugliotta responds to Ms. Williams that it had to be done and stated, quote, we've never had any problems with you. So insinuating that, in fact, the reason that she's being fired is because of all of these problems that they have with her, problems in which she's basically stood up for herself and for other people on the dance team, relating to situations that are potentially racial discrimination, potentially other types of religious discrimination, right? And so here we have management saying like they have a problem with her and that it's because of her bad attitude and that she's snarky. That's in direct contravention to the stated reason for termination that they give to her, which is that this is due to budget cuts. So they don't tell her that she's fired because she's a poor performer. They don't say she's fired for anything other than these are budget cuts. And yet they also say that she's snarky and that she has a bad attitude. And again, those are typically tropes that are racial or potentially have some racial undertones. All right, so we are all the way up to April 27th of 2023, and this is a meeting that Lizzo calls for all of the dancers, in which she's going to talk about Williams being fired. And during that meeting, Lizzo says, I've heard that somebody had a problem with Williams being fired, and she demands to know who questioned her decision to fire Ms. Williams, and she reminds the dance cast that she has eyes and ears everywhere. Lizzo also stated that her preference was that the dance cast refrain from socializing with Ms. Williams before Ms. Williams left New Orleans, where the tour was performing that night. And afterwards, Lizzo finally gave the group some performance notes. During that meeting, Ms. Davis, who apparently also, in addition to anxiety and binge eating and depression, she also suffers from an eye condition. And the eye condition acts up when she's in stressful situations. So she's had a habit of making audio recordings of interactions so that she can review them in a less stressful environment. As the tour camp had become incredibly tense for Ms. Davis, and the original intent of the meeting was for Lizzo to provide performance notes that could have been crucial for the dancers, Ms. Davis recorded the meeting so that she could review it later. Well, this sends Lizzo into a tizzy. And about 5 days later, she calls the dancers in for an emergency wardrobe fitting. And as they arrive to that fitting, management and security are there waiting for the entire dance cast. They take each of the dancers' phones, and then Lizzo comes into the room. And Lizzo says, I know one of you recorded the meeting, the April 27th meeting, and she's furious. She's hurling expletives at the group, and she goes around the group person by person until somebody's going to tell her who made the recordings. And finally, Miss Davis admits, I made a recording, and then she explained why she did it. And she also explained that she had never had any intent to harm Lizzo. And in essence, Lizzo says, quote, there is nothing you can say to make me believe you. She then berates Miss Davis, and Miss Quigley berates Miss Davis, and then basically fires her on the spot. Lizzo fires her on the spot. Well, that prompts Miss Rodriguez to get into the fray. And she asks if she could have a word with Lizzo. And in that meeting with Lizzo, she explains that she really doesn't appreciate how Lizzo has handled the situation with Miss Davis, and that she feels disrespected. And so she actually resigns. And that resignation ends up really pissing off both Miss Quigley and Lizzo, who start yelling at Miss Rodriguez and Miss Davis, calling them disrespectful. And then Lizzo aggressively approaches Miss Rodriguez, cracking her knuckles, balling her fists, and exclaiming, "You're lucky. You're so fucking lucky." Miss Rodriguez feared that Lizzo intended to hit her and would have done so if the other dancers hadn't stepped in to intervene. And then as she walks out, Lizzo leaves the room, she raises her middle fingers and yells, "Bye, bitch." So that's a lot to unpack, right? I mean, clearly we have a situation that's been escalating over a while. That's the picture that's being painted, in which, the dancers are treated pretty roughly, which I don't think is unusual, though, from an industry perspective. And then Lizzo is really kind of dealing these two last terminations out herself. She had somebody else fire the first employee that was fired, but then she does the dirty work with this last one, particularly Miss Davis, who gets fired by Lizzo directly. And then we have Miss Rodriguez, who's basically resigning as a result of how they're treating Miss Davis. Okay, so then Miss Davis is actually forced to stay behind, and she's detained in the room where the meeting had taken place. One of the security guards keep her in the room and search her phone. They go through her phone, they go through her iCloud to see if she still had the recording, even though she had said that she deleted it. They search her phone, they do a thorough search and confirm that she's telling the truth. But this is all going to be related to that false imprisonment claim. It says that she let her search her phone. She let them search her phone voluntarily. So that's, an interesting fact. So she's staying there, allowing them to search her phone, but feels like she can't leave. After finally being released from her confinement, she hurries to her hotel room, where she meets up with Miss Rodriguez, and then they go to the airport. And essentially at that point, they're all concerned. Lizzo, Miss Davis and Miss Rodriguez are concerned for their safety until they get out of Dodge, which I think is New Orleans at the time. But I'm not sure. So that's it. That is 22 pages full of pretty salacious factual allegations. Some of them I'm like, so what? I don't see how there's really any legal claims or legal merit to some of these facts. They're probably being included more to give kind of a context or a whole picture of how everybody is treated, not just these three dancers. But it also does show the timeline that they're trying to set up, which is, look, they're hired by Lizzo herself on this. At least two of the three dancers are hired on this reality show. They clearly did well enough to win that reality show and get their spots as dancers. And so it's really not until the time in which they start complaining about how they're being paid, that all of a sudden their performance is called into question. And that's a common tactic with employers who are looking to push out employees that are raising claims about maltreatment, discrimination, retaliation, etc. What we'll often see is that once the employee complains, whether it's in an official capacity like going to HR, or whether it's just talking to other employees, once it's found out by management, they then start doing things to try to call out that particular employee's performance. And here, it doesn't sound like any one of the dancers was necessarily singled out, right? All of the dancers are told that they're not performing well, or that they're not allowed to drink before a show, and that if they weren't drinking before a show, well, then they should be performing better, is what the implication was. So, I mean, these are some facts that some of them are I would say, okay, not a big deal. Others are pretty powerful, and they're demonstrating kind of a timeline that are going to be important when we get into these causes of action. So that's a lot. Those are some really meaty factual allegations. But now that we have those under our belt, we're actually going to break this part of the show up, and we're going to save next time for looking at the causes of action and the legal elements required to prove those causes of action, to sustain them. After that, we're going to have another series in which my wonderful associate, Megan Kelly, is going to come on and talk about the defenses and the motion to strike that Lizzo's defense team filed, and go through those defenses. And then finally, in the last part of the series, we're going to look at what the court has to say, which claims are going to stay in and which are going to be tossed. Stay tuned for more Lizzo. And if you liked this show or you liked our content, definitely be sure to like and subscribe. Thanks so much, guys. Thanks for joining us today on Pop Your Biz. For more information about my law firm, Business Law Group, check out our website at www.lawgroup.biz. You can also find us on all the major platforms, including Insta and Facebook, as well as LinkedIn. As always, if you liked this content, I really appreciate your positive reviews, comments, and sharing this show with others.